Hello, welcome once again to the Science for Policy podcast. My name is Toby, and today I'm joined by Tracey Brown. Tracey is the director of Sense, a charity that campaigns for more transparency and understanding of science in general, and in particular how scientific evidence is used in policymaking and public life. So, hi Tracey, thanks very much for joining me.
Hello, great pleasure.
So, Sense About Science, it's obviously a very prominent and active organisation. I know many of our listeners, at least those based in Europe, not just Britain, will be aware of your work in many different areas. One thing that strikes me is that it seems like there are kind of two prongs to your mission. So it seems from the outside, perhaps you could comment on it, at least two prongs. So one is the more traditional campaigning NGO type role, where you're advocating like the value of science, or I suppose good evidence generally, in making decisions across the piece, in fact, but in particular in public policy. But then also alongside that, you have this kind of parallel prong where you try to equip people not just with enthusiasm for evidence, but also with the kind of mindset and conceptual tools to engage with that evidence, understand where it comes from and question it, critique it. So you're not just saying science is important, as it might appear at the outset, but also we need to get better at understanding and using that science. What do you think of that way of putting things? Does it make sense to you?
It absolutely makes sense to me, Toby. And I think it's also something that we encounter quite a lot, which is we promote sound science and evidence in public life as a public good. Not as a position in terms of funding of science or everybody should understand science. I don't believe that people should understand the laws of motion any more than they should understand what a sonnet is or the rule of law. I think we think of thinking scientifically as an important public tool. One way of looking at that is that, people in authority have got the guns and the money, and all that's left to the rest of us is knowledge. If we want to describe the world that we're living in and how we think we should be living in that world. And so that's how we go about things, which is to think about it from the point of view of things like accountability, understanding the nature of a decision, understanding what might harm us and what might do us good. How do we describe the world? How do we describe statistically, for example, things that we want to improve and things that aren't good enough or are unfair? And those are all important public tools. And if we as a public throw them off, either in frustration at those wretched scientists or because we disagree with the findings of research and so on, we actually throw a very big baby out with the bathwater. And so that would explain to you why, there is a two-pronged approach, really, which is that we are, on the one hand, knocking on the doors of people who are making decisions and asking them to base them on evidence, asking them to deal in currency that we all have access to. And on the other hand, making sure that we have a public that is putting that pressure on public life and able to use those tools to make decisions and come to conclusions for themselves. And I suppose you could say there's a third prong, which is making sure that our research community is also equipped to speak in human and in a way that actually gives people access to what it is they're working on.
Yeah, so I find it intriguing the way you frame it as a kind of public good in the sense of levelling the playing field between decision makers and the rest of us, because the facts are something everyone can have. It's a playing field we can all compete on, unlike, as you say, the guns and the money. And that then makes me realise, given that way of framing the issue, that there's no doubt hundreds of different topics that flow from that, which we could choose to talk about today. But we have chosen just one, and that is the topic of data science and its use in policy. So I'm aware that's quite a broad term. Maybe you could kick us off with an outline of what exactly data science means, what you want to include under that broad umbrella.
It's a very difficult thing to define, in fact, data science, because a lot of what we mean when we talk about data science is decision science. It's how we pull together the information we need for a decision. But what we're particularly focusing on is the use of modelling. And I should first say, when you say there's a big range of things we could deal with, and of course that's what we feel. We have people knocking at our door from all over the world telling us about issues that need to be dealt with, and it's a real strain sometimes to decide what's important. One of the ways that we do that is we look around at who else is doing what, who should be doing what, and can prompt them to do it. And there every now and again we get a subject where we just think, how on earth has this happened that we've gone so far down a path? And in the case of data science, this is exactly where we are, where we're using it to make really fundamental decisions. And yet we have decision makers and a public and a media who feel unable to question it adequately. And it's, I think, to some extent with data science, it's a bit explained by the whiz bang wow of it all, that this is supposed to provide answers to our questions and in a way that we could never do before. And of course it does. It's amazing, the ability to process huge amounts of information and to ask questions of things that we just could never put those questions before. On the other hand, there's a lot of obscurity in it, and particularly when it comes to looking at complex problems where you have multiple factors, so you have multiple sources of data, and you're putting those together, effectively many ingredients in the recipe. We need to know how to ask about that recipe. And that's really what we're focusing on, is the use of data science and modelling in decision making. And I think kind of key areas that will make that very familiar to people are obviously the COVID crisis has meant that, predicting and understanding the relationship between different actions and their outcomes is something that has meant a lot of use of modelling. But climate also, climate's very big on the policy agenda at the moment. And again, rests very heavily on the nature of the models that people are using and the inputs into those models. So asking key questions about where that has come from and the assumptions that are being made is something that we think is urgent for society now.
Well, so with something like climate science, it is really hard to imagine the science even getting off the ground at all without some way of processing, which I guess means like automatically processing the huge amount of data that you have and then reading out implications of it. Because with climate science, you're often modeling the climate of the whole planet, which is obviously a very complex system. But then to think about it the other way around, isn't all science essentially recording and processing data anyway, and then trying to use the result to confirm your hypothesis? I mean, there's a lot more data in the model in these cases now, but do you think, or to what extent do you think data modeling is really a departure as a methodology from the quote unquote classical scientific paradigm?
Yeah, no, in many ways it repeats many of the things, it perhaps underlines many of the things that we would always say about things. So, for example, we've just got used to the idea that we should ask, is it peer reviewed? And perhaps even better, has there been a systematic review that's looked at the literature in the rounds? And then suddenly we're confronted with something that doesn't go through that traditional peer review system. It may be that some aspects of the modelling process do. It may be that some parts of the statistical work have been through peer review, but the use of the model perhaps being generated in one set of conditions and then being used in another, that hasn't been peer reviewed. And so that question of the reliability, the scrutiny and so on, that's an old question. And it's rearing its head afresh. And we need to relearn these things. There's other things to do with, human judgment. People can get very locked into the piece of research that they're doing and fail to step back and say, does this actually make sense in a broader landscape? And, you can see similarly, you're advocating for people to use a bit of sensible judgment in what they're doing. And so there are just questions to do with how we think about knowledge, how we rely on it, how we understand its strengths and weaknesses, and particularly its uncertainties, how we express those uncertainties. And many of those are very similar. We find ourselves, when talking to policymakers, and something we've been doing a lot over the last year, we find ourselves in similar terrain as when we're talking about other areas of evidence. It's just rather shocking that these questions are far less on the agenda around data science. And I think it's in part because that we've kind of got to a stage with it all where it's embarrassing to say, by the way, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay. So sorry to labour the point, but I'm trying to figure out how radical this stuff is. And maybe I'm missing the point here, but if so, just clear it up for me. So you've got your traditional scientific paradigm where you have observation, hypothesis, experiment, and then confirmation or not. And then the kind of extended scientific method of disputation and community review and peer review, capital P, capital R, and then gradually coming to theories about the world or whatever. So now coming to the brave new world of data science, I'm not quite clear how this fits into that paradigm, if it does at all. So, for instance, you suggested that a particular use of a particular model might skip the peer review step, for instance. I guess I'm trying to get at whether we need a whole new way of thinking about this kind of research, or if we just need to kind of tame it to bring it in line with the methodologies we all know and love.
Yes and no. So there definitely are new things that we can perhaps come on to look at, the idea of having test data, for example. There are new requirements of how you go about things. There are different things to explain, for sure. But perhaps just if I could compare, let's think about it from the product end, that if you were developing a new compound for treatment of stroke or something, and you would run clinical trials, you do phase 1, you do phase 2, you do phase 3, and then, you would publish your findings in a number of formats, regulatory and also in the literature. It would be then, considered quite, it does happen, of course, and there's procedures for this, but it would be considered quite unusual for you to then decide that this was a cure for glaucoma and start marketing it as such. Whereas what we're seeing in data science is that people are developing models in one set of conditions, and then the application of those is being stretched out to other things. The thing I would highlight most in this is that quite often what we're seeing is a problem solving. So, it looks very similar to somebody says, look, we've got people traveling all over this big city, and we need to predict the numbers, and where we're going to have, fire safety issues or risks of crowds and platforms overcrowding and so on. And we need to do this better, and we need to do it better than just jumping in and picking up a sample of those people and working out what we think they're therefore going to do on a regular basis. So we can do it better by having kind of almost real-time reports of people's movements and responding to those. But then, taking that and putting that in another context where the circumstances are quite different, people might behave differently. Their behaviour might not be so predictable. And then you think, well, we need to start again in our thinking a little bit here. The question is, at what point does that happen? What you tend to see is, one authority that has innovated a solution, a company or an organisation has innovated it, and they then go and sell it as a solution to other people. And we're seeing it a lot in areas of decision making around resourcing, and also, I think probably many people are aware that there are decisions around things like the risks. For example, which people should be considered for early release from prison, and those kinds of things, or who in making an application for a loan or for social security, who is most likely to be fraudulent. And that sort of thing. So you're seeing a lot of products there that are being lifted from one set of conditions and put into new circumstances.
I see. And the problem is that it's based on what's basically an untested assumption that what works in condition A will also work in condition B.
That's right. And I think that, then we've got other issues to consider, haven't we? Which is that what the innovations of being able to access these huge, great data sets and process them have enabled is for us to kind of go fishing in the data to look for relationships. So I think it's quite helpful. When I set out on this and I was trying to unpick it as someone who really isn't in this area, I did a bit on social statistics, but it's not my area. What I found really useful to think about is that you have two kinds of data broadly being generated. You have data that's being generated administratively and in the process of what we're doing. When we walk around with our smartphones and we're generating a lot of information about where we go and what we do. And in fact, as we've seen with the COVID lockdowns, that's suddenly become of great interest because we're trying to look at those data to see whether people are staying home when they should do, and what the impact is of stopping people from working in the office and so on. But that we generate data like that, and then we can go looking in those data to try and draw some conclusions and make some associations, find proxies for the things that we're trying to ask about. Like looking at whether people moving around with their smartphones actually tells us whether or not they're obeying the rules. Then we also have data which is generated in experimental conditions, and that's rather different, because that is data where you've actually attempted to design out some of the biases. And I think trying to appreciate that those two things are rather different and that they can't, that they come with very, very different warnings attached, is probably a really good first step for us to think about, were the data actually designed, were they actually gathered in order to answer this question, or are we sort of opportunistically using them?
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. And of course, by no coincidence at all, we happen to have a very clear case study right in our laps, which is the use of data modeling in the last 12 months responding to COVID-19. So we don't need to focus just on that, but you raise it, so it's a good one to think about. If you're trying to assess whether people are following the lockdown rules, say, and you need that information so you can make public health decisions or policy decisions of whatever kind, surely using a proxy is better than having nothing at all. Like if you just go and ask people, you aren't going to get a reliable answer. So how else can you get that data without using things like mobile phone use or public transport use or whatever?
Well, that's right. And actually, I think perhaps differently from that, I actually think it's a very good thing in this case that what we have is the opportunity to look at something. When it comes to something like reported behaviour, it's been really, really difficult in research over the years to deal with the fact that there's a lot of error in people's recall. There's obviously bias in the way they like to think of how they behave. And obviously when you've got rules and regulations, people tend to varnish what they tell you. So there's all sorts of problems with using reported behaviour. And we've seen this in relation to, compliance issues, but also, people's description of what they eat. And how much they exercise and those kinds of things. So in that sense, what we can do now with data is really exciting. And I don't want to, by insisting that we have good critical questioning, I wouldn't want to in any way undermine the idea that that data science is potentially making huge improvements in what we can do, both in terms of our research knowledge and our decision making. So it's incredibly valuable. And that example of whether we're seeing a decline in movement, using Google Maps data, for example, to find out whether lockdowns have stopped people from moving long distances or making so many journeys and that kind of thing, really useful. It would be a very different question, though, if you were to start to rely on those data for deciding whether or not you were going to be punitive towards people. And then you would be wanting to ask a very different question about, well, how reliable actually is this? And, is it actually telling us? So we can say it's telling us that people are moving around more or less. But what we can't say is whether they're moving around more or less in ways which are breaking the rules. And we can't just leap to that assumption. And in fact, actually, you have seen people leap into that assumption, that it must necessarily mean that they're breaking the rules. But, for example, during the first phases of lockdowns in many European cities, there were shortages and there was sort of panic buying in various places, and Spain had a bit of it and so on. And, as a result of that, people were having to go to more than one shop to try and do their weekly shopping. So you were seeing the fact that people seemed to be out and about, moving around a lot. But in fact, they were having to go to 3 shops instead of 1 in order to get the week's food. So I think you have to be very careful about drawing those sorts of conclusions or imagining that the whole of your question is answered by the data.
All right. So you've mentioned various difficulties and limitations, most of which seem to be in how to interpret this kind of evidence and understand its limitations. So they're kind of challenges on the client side, if that makes sense. In which case, do you have something like a toolkit for policymakers or other people who want to make use of data modeling? When you're given the results of some big analysis like this, maybe it seems too good to be true. What kinds of questions should you be asking?
Well, it's very difficult to actually pin it down to questions, and difficult in the sense that trying to get mathematicians and others to agree on what those questions should be has been a really big challenge. But for us, we've arrived at kind of 3 key questions, and over the last sort of year and a half, 18 months, the questions have sort of borne up. It doesn't, obviously, you can't condense everything, but these questions which open the door to the next set of questions that you need to ask. They open the door to the 3 conversations that you really need to have. The first of all is, where does it come from? So that perhaps covers the point about, was it derived from experimental conditions, or is it something that, has been generated by user data, for example, therefore we might have a biased sample or self-selecting group. So first of all, where does it come from? Let's have a think about that, and let's have a think about what we've actually done with that information, how it's been processed. Then, what are the assumptions that are being made? So, if we've put together 2 data sets, that was an interesting one if you look at Google Maps data, because you then have to say, well, actually, are we assuming this represents the entirety of the population? Or in fact, actually, much older people tend not to have Google Maps on their phone when they're moving around. So we've ended up with a data set that's quite different. And we're making the assumption that we're talking about all of society. In fact, we're perhaps talking about the most active section of society there. So what assumptions are being made about the relationships between different data? Are we assuming that farming practices make a particular contribution to climate change? And therefore, when we're looking at how to sort of bring those data together, we're making a certain set of assumptions about the interplay between different factors, and those need to be made bare. Similarly, when we're seeing applications in things like fraud detection, we need to think about what assumptions are being made about the relationships between particular characteristics of people and their propensity to commit fraud. So, there's a lot behind when we sort of put the numbers in and get the answer out. But I suppose that's the black box question: what assumptions are being made? And then, can it bear the weight we want to put on it? And this is important because, there isn't necessarily such a thing as a bad model and a good model. Not always. There are some things where you just think, well, why would you go about it like that? Or, or where the test data, you didn't bother. Those are there's things that are well done and not so well done in scientific practice. But there's also, it depends on the question you're asking. And if we're making decisions about something like whether somebody can get a mortgage or whether they're entitled to a pension, that's quite a different decision than making idle observations about human patterns of behaviour over time, whether we're all driving more or taking the train more, or those kinds of things, where we can afford a certain room for error. So I think sometimes we get really great insights and there's something we want to put into the mix, but we wouldn't necessarily want major policy decisions being based on them. Mentioning the COVID crisis, obviously that's something that people have suddenly found themselves in this position where there's a lot of work been going on in medical surveillance, in disease surveillance. There's a lot of work been going on to try and map new developments, to think about how they affect different countries around the world. And then suddenly you're wanting to put quite a lot of weight on those in trying to figure out what's going to happen next. And so you've seen that relationship between the research community and the policy community taking many different forms. And many governments are trying to figure out, are we calling these people in to tell us the answer? Are we calling them in just to kind of throw something in the pot as a mix of information? It's been a really big challenge, I think, just thinking about that question of, well, what weight? And I think, you can imagine the scene, can't you? Which is that the scientific advisors being asked, well, what's going to happen and what should we do? And the scientific advisor is saying, well, it depends. I can tell you something, depending on what it is that you want to, what sort of weight you want to put on this. I can give you an interesting observation, or if it's the case that you want a cut and dried answer, we're going to have a bit more of a problem. And so I think there's been a bit of a challenge going on there. That's perhaps downplaying it. It's been a huge challenge between the research community and policymakers.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So I want to pull out a couple of things, some of which you've mentioned, and one or two that have been mentioned by other guests on this podcast. So one is about spurious accuracy, or spurious claims to precision. So when you have, for example, a model that claims, 18,253 flu deaths in London this year, or whatever it happens to be, right? Where the model is spitting out this number and is kind of taken as gospel. I think in the crude version of this problem, the number is just taken as gospel. But I think even in more subtle versions, like the fact that that kind of number can be generated gives a false impression of the margin of error around the model or the data that was fed into it at the other end. Is that something you're concerned about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think spurious precision is a real danger, and it's very misleading. And then there's also this thing that when you start putting a number on something, it then just becomes a bit runaway, and people don't sort of step back and think about it. I find it strange, and I know that this is something I discussed quite a lot with Peter Gluckman, the former New Zealand chief scientist.
He's in fact the one who I recall mentioning.
Because he's, and the point he and I were discussing in a recent event was just why is it that numbers seem to encourage people to put aside their judgment? It's like as soon as you've put the number down, it almost becomes a fact. And it's very hard then, to chase after those sorts of numbers. So yes, you get spurious precision. And I think, one way around that, in just in communication terms, I think there's a lot of experimentation going on, but producing ranges, of course, is a really helpful thing to do. And I do think that the COVID statistics that many governments are producing are now beginning to experiment a bit with showing those ranges. So the calculation of excess deaths, for example, people are showing ranges. There's a lot of interesting attempts to try and get this across to a much wider public. I think we've taken some big steps forward just in the sort of visualization of data over this period of time, simply because, it's a different audience, it's a much bigger audience than is usually looking over official statistics and medical data.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I think these are trickier issues than is often realised. So this obviously gets to science communication, which is a hobby horse of both of ours. So let's not derail the conversation too far. But in the interest of speculation, I wonder if part of it is that when people hear a number, they kind of assume, subconsciously or otherwise, that number has some calculation behind it. If you hear most people are doing X or more people are doing X than Y, well, that's one thing. But if you hear, we think about 88,000 people are doing X, well, that kind of implies a more rigorous underpinning, which you can't access, even if that's not the case in the end, right? With ranges, I think it's really hard because by the very end of the process, when you make a policy decision, the ranges and the uncertainty that they represent has to be collapsed into a decision, right? It's binary. You do it or you don't do it, or else you choose from a list of options or whatever. So that means at some point along the process, the range or the verbal expression of uncertainty needs to become a value, if that makes sense. And I suppose what you need to try to do is preserve the uncertainty as long as you can through the process, so you don't end up doing your rounding, as it were, too early and forget that the uncertainty existed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think you see this with election polling, actually, in particular, and I've fallen victim to this myself in a way. When you get an election result like the US presidential election, either of the most recent ones, in fact, where the result looks different at first glance from what people expected, and the pollsters get a lot of flack for getting their predictions wrong, but they reply, actually, we didn't predict a single number, we predicted a range, and this result is within the range. It's not right in the middle of it, to be sure, but that's the point of a range. It can be anywhere, so we got it right. And if you're surprised, then you misunderstood what our model was telling you.
The Clinton-Trump election was a really good example where when you actually, a lot of polling companies got some flack for that, but when you actually look back at what they said, they were right. Within the range of uncertainty they were communicating, they were right. The thing was just so close to call. And similarly, with the UK's referendum on Brexit, it was people weren't that far out. It's just that the decision was poised right around the middle. So, a small movement either way was going to take the decision either way. And so I felt quite sorry for polling companies, and polling organisations around the last US election, the previous US election, because when first of all, they were really criticised. And when I look back at their stuff, they'd actually communicated it relatively well. Obviously, it was in that febrile atmosphere where people were really keen to kind of seize upon the fact that this was showing that Hillary Clinton was out in front, and that became the news headline. So the error was in the reporting of those, for sure.
Yeah, and I think in the individual internalization of it as well. When you ask the question, you want to know the answer, who is going to win?
Yeah.
And when you're told, well, it's very close, it could go either way, well, that doesn't satisfy your question. So you say, okay, fine, but which way is it leaning?
Yeah.
And the answer to that might be, well, it's leaning towards Clinton. And then, of course, Trump wins. And then you come back complaining, hey, you told me Clinton was going to win.
Yeah. And I think the crucial point is what you talk about in terms of how much we preserve that thinking. So whilst we can't, get inside people's heads and deal with the fact that we're looking for confirmation bias, we're rooting for a particular outcome, perhaps in a situation that's unfolding. Wishful thinking or pessimistic thinking or whatever, there's no way of us actually overturning that. We're human. But what we can do is take care to make sure, insist upon that those uncertainties being carried through. A good example of that actually is in the COVID planning, because a lot of governments have modelled out their worst case scenario, their reasonable worst case scenario, the sort of middle, their reasonable best case scenario and their best case scenario. I mean, they've got kind of 4 or 5 scenarios. And then they decide to work to one of them. So, in many cases, like in Ireland, they work to their reasonable worst case scenario. I think that was the popular thing to do. But along the way, sometimes you just kind of, the fact that it's the reasonable worst case scenario, which is not the sexiest title when you're trying to write about it in a short news item or something, but it just drops away. And then I think the people themselves, because they're working they're sort of saying, well, this is like the number of deaths that we may see in that situation. And therefore, we're going to use that as a way of evaluating what's actually happening. It just gets written more and more firmly in, as though somehow, it has a sort of independence and a life of its own.
Yeah, so a working assumption, a justified working assumption, kind of slides into becoming first a prediction and then eventually a baseline.
Yeah. And how we frame, if we're going to kind of delve into the psychology of this, how we frame something in numbers is really, really influential. I mean, you'll be aware that, the classic thing when you go to an expensive restaurant is you look at the wine list and they always include something really very expensive on the wine list, because then you go for somewhere around the middle. And lots of research has shown that people will spend another €10 a bottle on their wine if they're given that bigger price range to select from, and so it tells us what's normal, as a backdrop to what's going on. So if we're working to a sort of, this is the sort of number of deaths that we want to bring down, well, our starting point is already framed by that. Before the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2, we were not walking around with a ready reckoner about how many people in our countries died each day. So we're being told figures about deaths, and we don't know, is that a big figure or a small figure? I mean, if everyone's honest about this, I'm sure that many people in leading ministerial positions in government didn't actually know whether that was a big or small figure when they were first told how many people died in hospital. We're now in some countries, we're dealing with, numbers in the hundreds. And at the beginning, we were shocked by numbers in the tens, but we haven't sort of registered our shock in a bigger way. And I think, the framing, we need to be very aware of how we frame. When we start putting those numbers out, you talk about spurious precision, we start putting those numbers out into society. What it also does is it tells us what's normal.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've dragged us a bit, sorry, from the central topic, but it's an interesting conversation. Okay, so I've read a bit about the work Centre About Science has done on this, and there's one area in particular which I find honestly very challenging to think about, and perhaps you can help me figure it out, or at least figure out how to think about it. And it's something you mentioned already, I think, which is black box reasoning. So I think there's a special case here when it comes to a particular kind of machine learning. With regular data modeling, you can see the output, and if your model predicts something weird or odious, like, hey, you should really only hire men for this kind of job, you can interrogate why the model came up with that conclusion from that data, and you can fix it. But then there are algorithms that do the data modeling work with literally no model at the start. They have no input at all except the data itself. They kind of generate their own model as they go along. I think there's no doubt this machine learning process works because we have AIs that can, beat grandmasters at chess and Go, which people have been trying to program computers how to do explicitly for 30 or 40 years, and they can write dubious novels and so on, even though they've never been actually taught any of those things explicitly. And it's kind of a wonderful, almost magical new avenue for discovery, because these free-floating AIs don't inherit our existing ideas about correlations, and they can stumble across connections we might never have imagined, right? But then that also has a dark side, because their reasoning is opaque. Nobody knows why the model produced the output that it produced. There's kind of no answer in principle. I mean, if you ask a chess AI to explain why it made the move it did, all it can do is show you like a complete map of the neural network it's assembled, which isn't a lot of help in troubleshooting. So am I characterizing that right, firstly? And then secondly, is it something that you see as a worry in public policy? Are those kinds of models used there?
It's a worry in public policy, but it's also a worry actually for some of those big organisations who have designed some of this, because, I mean, you've got a situation now where it's very difficult in some areas for Google to go back in and alter its algorithms, because those algorithms have been written not by them. And so when stuff starts to go wrong, it's really hard to find out where it's gone wrong and to tweak it. And I think perhaps the thing that listeners have most encounter this with, unless they're keen chess players, is things like Netflix and Amazon giving you sort of recommended buys based on what other people who've also bought the same thing as you have bought, and that's one of those things where when it goes well, it's incredibly useful. We suddenly remember to buy the right batteries for the thing that we've just ordered, and when it's wrong, it's creepy. And we find it really intrusive and sort of weird, and sometimes, I mean, I don't know if you've noticed this, but every now and again you used to go through a period where your Google search or your recommended buys on Amazon or wherever suddenly seem really, really out of kilter, and it just seems not to kind of get it right, and it's very frustrating. And I think that's a good example of where the machine can start learning the wrong information, or according an importance to things that turn out to not be important. And so because there is no discernment there about what's relevant and what's not relevant. So I think that's the crucial point to understand, is that when we have that free learning environment, I suppose, that there is nothing to say that this information is relevant or not relevant. And you've touched on the fact that sometimes including information may be not just an irrelevance. The consequence isn't just that, I get a suggestion that I should buy a really comfy pair of slippers that look like something my grandmother should have worn. And that's clearly wrong. But sometimes the recommendation is quite a serious one, which is we've found, the use of algorithms in job applications and job sifting and that kind of thing. And the machine starts to learn things about people's postcodes, or it starts to learn things about where they went to school. And what you get is attempts to eliminate bias, class bias or racial bias between men and women. Those things actually reassert themselves because the machine starts to identify other patterns that are associated. Things like, for example, women of a certain age, women in their late 30s, may well have taken a career break for children. And so you'll have a career break in people's CVs. The machine has every reason to learn that there might be an achievement gap, where somebody ends up sort of 3 or 4 years behind where they would expect to be in their attainment level. And so therefore what you get is that pattern starting to be implemented as a way of sifting. And so there have been a number of cases where recruitment usage of machine learning has really gone quite badly.
Right. Well, I want to give you the opportunity to talk a bit about what Sense About Science is doing to tackle these issues, in particular as they affect policymakers and the way science is used in decision making, because I know you're quite active there. So what are your most important activities, and what do you recommend to people in policy making positions who are faced with this stuff?
I think the most important thing for us at the moment is to focus on whether our decision makers are well equipped to understand this process. And I think, we've got into some of the detail here about what kind of questions you might ask, and there's so much more to say about that. I would like us to be in a position where those in procurement in government just don't feel afraid of opening those questions up. But I think there's a kind of top line thing of making people aware just how much decision making is in this domain. Perhaps the coronavirus pandemic has done us a favour in making very conscious. I don't think normally government ministers are thinking about models or their use of models. The press are rarely talking about them in this kind of a fashion. And so I think it's an interesting situation we're in now. There's some awareness of this, but there is still shock when you talk to decision makers, and we've been talking to people at the Commission and in national governments about the extent to which their own departments in government are now using algorithmically based applications on data to make decisions. And you can see why that's very attractive. I mean, it suggests that there's a sort of fairness to it. It suggests that it's efficient, because human judgment takes time and is fallible in all sorts of ways we can identify. But I just don't think it's something that's registered. The economic forecasting, city planning, rural services, suicide prevention, fraud detection, troop deployment, every single sort of department of government is using data science in these different ways. And so it's something that I think governments need to get their heads around, that this is actually what's going on. I think that's I think that's our top line thing, because then, of course, you get the nitty gritty of it, which is to say, well, do government departments actually have the skills for procurement? And that's another kind of question. But those two things are both very, very important, and they really concern me.
Yeah, understood. So you mentioned working with the European Commission. Tell us a bit about what you've been doing there, if there's anything you can reveal at this stage.
Yeah, I'm delighted to say that I'm working with the Joint Research Centre of the Commission. About 300 modellers work across the Commission, and deep in the kind of back rooms of their modelling work, to find that they're also really concerned about this, and that I think from their side, particularly concerned because they are pushing. They've got output going into decision making. And they want to have the confidence that those decision makers know what they're looking at. And also trying to lead the way a bit on some of the transparency standards, I think, to sort of start to set a bit of a European-wide, if not international, a European-wide standard of what kind of information you should be expected to provide in a model, and in what sort of format, because there's no standard format for doing this. There's no, we know how to report a clinical trial, but people don't know how to report on models, and so that's work to be done. So they've been thinking about that, but they're very switched on about the kind of challenges for policymakers. And so we held a round table, one of those places where it was okay to admit you don't know, with some very senior directors from all over the Commission and from Parliament. And we've looked at how to create a very sort of snappy guidance that gives people some sort of a foot in the door, a way in to asking questions. It was really interesting to me that not one person turned down the invitation to come. So I think and it was a sort of quite a late in the day invitation to some very senior people, and absolutely everybody came. And so that tells us something about the recognition. I don't think a year ago we would have got that response. I think it would have been seen as a really esoteric issue, and that best dealt with by those clever people in the modelling CC mod in JRC. But now I think people recognise this is something that they need to get their heads around.
Well, congratulations.
This year we should be in a position where we get that together. So unlike much guidance and sort of policy development, it's actually moving very quickly. So I'm quite hopeful that we're going to have something in place over this year, and that we'll be launching it. The plan is Parliament wants us to launch it in the European Parliament this year. So, and that's obviously quite top level, but it's a good start, I think, a really good start to kind of identifying those policy questions. And, reasonably, if people don't, particularly politicians, don't go into politics because they've come from this kind of a background of decision making. They make decisions politically, and therefore it's quite reasonable to expect, to have to break things down a bit into working out what are the kind of key questions here, what's at stake.
So when you're talking about some kind of Europe-wide, or as you say, international way of presenting things, what do you mean? Is this like a standard template of the information you need to publish alongside your model? So there's like a list of bullet points. Perhaps you could say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that's really, I think, this issue's been around now for some time, and I think is probably the biggest challenge. What has happened is people have attempted to write a kind of reporting framework, only to find that it's just different depending on whether you're using AI in healthcare or you're doing climate modelling. So trying to write a kind of detailed requirement for these things, you're just going to end up with something that's not applicable. So a kind of hot and difficult example of this is the UN was trying to develop guidance for the use of unmanned weaponry. So this is basically where you have decisions being made about whether a target is a human target or not, and that these are being made by machines. So, just to frighten everybody that bit more about how much this technology, this way of thinking is developed. So the UN is trying to sort of run to catch up with the deployment of this kind of use of modelling and data, coming up with some guidance. Well, the requirements of that are going to be very, very different, and they found it really difficult. I think we have to have some principles in place that are broadly applicable, and then leave it to different sectors to kind of work out how to apply those principles in their own case. The principle really, I think we can borrow a lot from engineering here and construction. So that they have been through a lot of this over the last 3 decades. If you look at construction, the commissioning of something is as important as the building of it. So do you know what spec that was built to? Have you tested it? If you've built a new station on a metro line, how do you know that all of that cabling was the right spec for the amount of electricity, for the volts that are going to be through it? How do you know that the distance from passengers in the station is safe? How do you know that people can escape in a fire? How do you know that ladder that's been inserted would actually evacuate people from that office? It's all very well to say one person could go up it, but could 200? That kind of stuff. You need to know all that stuff, and it all needs to be tested. And when you receive it, you don't sign that off until you absolutely know, what spec and what standard that was delivered to, and whether it's all been done. And yet we don't really have that in this kind of a world of data and software, and I think we need to introduce that idea of, I suppose, what we would call is responsible handover, which is the person handing it over needs to lay bare everything you might need to know, and you receiving it should not receive it until you really feel like you know where that came from and to what spec it was delivered and why. And I think that's, I'm not saying bureaucracy, should mushroom here, but it's a basic principle, is that, do you know what you're getting?
Right, so that isn't just client side then, that implies work on both sides, like education and recognition.
Exactly.
On both sides, the client and the receiver, in this case, the policymaker.
Exactly.
Which has resonances, I think, with science advice more generally. It's a point that comes up in a lot of the conversations on this podcast, the need for both the advisor, the giver of the advice, and the receiver to understand what science can and can't do and how to use it responsibly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Tracey Brown of Sense About Science, thank you very much indeed for this conversation. And of course, I wish you all the best in promoting good sense about all this.
Thank you. Very much enjoyed it.
The Science for Policy podcast is produced by SAPEA. We're a consortium of Europe's academies and learning societies, and we're part of the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism. We provide evidence and expertise to inform the work of the group of chief scientific advisors. SAPEA is funded by the EU's Horizon 2020 programme for research and innovation, and you can find lots more information about us and our work at sapea.info. Finally, the rather lovely cello music that's playing right now is performed by Elizaveta Sushchenko, so I shall shut up and let you enjoy the last few bars. Bye for now.